frankly, I wanted death for myself. I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I know I will be in prison for the rest of my life. I know that I will have to turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a holocaust.
We already know Jeffrey Dahmer was a monster. But here's what we don't talk about enough. Why were most of his victims black? Was it just chance? Or was he targeting them on purpose? Did he get some kind of pleasure out of hurting them? And more importantly, why did he keep getting away with it? Was he protected by the system? Let's break it all down, starting with his first black victim. Stick with me on this video, because we're breaking it all down. What really happened, and why it matters. If you're into raw, honest stories like this, hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and let's get into it. On the night of March 25th, 1989, Anthony Sears ran into Jeffrey Dahmer at a gay bar in Milwaukee. He was bisexual, had a girlfriend, and worked at the Baker's Square restaurant in Milwaukee. Sears met Dahmer on the evening of March 25th, 1989 at the Milwaukee gay club La Cage. Later that night, when the bar closed, Sears' friend Jeffrey Connor drove him, Dahmer and Bob Keel, another friend of his, back to his grandmother's house. Before Connor let Anthony and Dahmer go, he reminded Sears that he was going to spend time with his family on Easter and asked him to call him in case he needed a ride back home. He had since never been seen again. According to his mother Marilyn, who didn't know he was going to be dead, Anthony was planning to see her on the next day to celebrate his recent promotion at his job at the Baker's Square restaurant as a manager, but he never showed up. As for Dahmer, he brought Sears inside his grandmother's house, where they had sex, and Dahmer gave him a drink that put him to sleep. Once Sears fell asleep, Dahmer killed and dismembered his body, mummifying his head and penis while the rest of the body was disposed. He eventually boiled his face by removing the skin and kept his skull as a souvenir. According to Dahmer, the body parts of Sears were in a black cabinet when he was serving a 1-year sentence for a second-degree sexual assault charge involving a teenage boy. In late July 1991, 2 years after his murder, Sears' remains were identified by a local coroner when the world discovered the infamous ruthless serial killer of all time. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't just target him for convenience or opportunity, he was attracted to him. Dahmer admitted that he was physically drawn to Anthony and felt a desire to keep him close. But instead of approaching him like a normal person, Dahmer did what he'd later do to many others. He killed him. Dahmer's attraction wasn't the kind of love or connection you'd expect. It was an obsession, a need to control and possess. And that brings us to the first reason Dahmer targeted black men, his sexual attraction to them. For Dahmer, the desire to keep them close wasn't about having a normal relationship. It was about owning them, about locking them in a twisted world where he had all the power. When he couldn't control that attraction any other way, he resorted to murder. Dahmer was drawn to black men, and this was the moment that confirmed it for him. He could only hold on to them if he took their lives. Raymond Smith, also known as Ricky Beeks, was a 32-year-old black man. He was Dahmer's second black victim. Dahmer met Raymond on the street, just like he did with many of his victims. He offered him $50 to come back to his apartment for sex and photos. It was an easy setup. Raymond needed the money, and Dahmer knew exactly what to say. Once they got back to Dahmer's apartment, he handed Raymond a drink laced with sleeping pills. After Raymond passed out, Dahmer strangled him. But it didn't stop there. Dahmer went out the next day, bought a Polaroid camera, and took pictures of Raymond's body in disturbing poses. He then kept Raymond's skull as a trophy after boiling and bleaching it. So why did he do it? Why another black man? This brings us to the second major reason Dahmer targeted black men. They were invisible to the system, and he knew it. By now, Dahmer had figured something out. He could kill young black men and no one was going to look for them right away. No major police investigations, no urgency. Some families didn't even know they were missing for days. Raymond was a black man from a low-income neighborhood. Exactly the kind of person Dahmer felt he could get away with murdering. So between his twisted attraction and the system's neglect, black men became his main targets. It wasn't just about desire. It was about who he could control, kill, and hide without getting caught. And in America, that meant black men. Something crazy happened with his third and fifth black victims. If you are loving this, kindly give us a one-time tap on the subscribe button. It motivates me to look out for in-depth details on crime documentaries. Edward Smith was 28 years old. Not much is widely known about his personal life, but what we do know is that he was a black man living in Milwaukee, and like the others, he met Jeffrey Dahmer at a bar. Dahmer used the same setup, offered him money to come back to his apartment for drinks and photos. Once they got there, he drugged Edward's drink, waited for him to pass out, and then strangled him. But with Edward, something different happened. Dahmer tried to keep his body intact by putting it in a freezer. He was experimenting now. He said he didn't want to lose the entire body like he had with the others. He wanted to preserve it, keep it close, almost like he wanted a permanent companion. But it didn't work. The body was damaged, and Dahmer said he was angry about that. So why does this murder matter in his pattern? By this point, it was clear. Dahmer wasn't just killing out of impulse anymore. He was planning. He was testing. And here's the link to why he kept targeting black men. He kept going after the same type of person. Young, often struggling, often black, and easy to lure with money. He knew no one was going to stop him. The previous murders hadn't drawn suspicion. And deep down, he believed these men could disappear, and no one in power would care. Edward Smith was killed, not just because Dahmer desired control, but because Dahmer knew he could get away with it. A poor black man's disappearance? That didn't make headlines, and Dahmer was counting on that. Ernest Miller was 22 years old when he met Jeffrey Dahmer. A soft-spoken young man with a passion for dance, Ernest had recently moved to Milwaukee, chasing the kind of dreams that too often get overlooked in communities like his. He studied ballet, he was creative, and those who knew him say he carried himself with quiet confidence and kindness. But Ernest was also a young black man in a city that had long ignored the struggles of people who looked like him. And it was in that blind spot where poverty, racism, and invisibility met that Dahmer hunted. Dahmer didn't choose his victims at random. He targeted black and brown men because he knew their disappearances wouldn't cause alarm. He admitted that race played a role, subconsciously or otherwise, and he understood that the police weren't going to look too hard for young black men who went missing. That's how he got away with it for so long. He knew the system wouldn't care. Ernest met Dahmer near a shopping mall where he was offered money to come back to his apartment for what was supposed to be a modeling session. It wasn't unusual. Many of Dahmer's victims were approached with offers of money or food. But Ernest never left that apartment. Dahmer drugged and murdered him, then desecrated his body in ways that still haunt the families of his victims. And when Ernest didn't come home, there were no headlines, no citywide search. Just another missing black man in Milwaukee. His life, his dreams of dancing, of building something bigger, were cut short and barely anyone noticed. Not because he didn't matter, but because society had already decided that his life was less important. David Thomas was 23 years old, a father, a friend, a young man who, despite the struggles of his environment, was known for his sense of humor and his easy smile. He had a child he loved deeply, and he was trying, like so many others, to stay afloat in a city where life for young black men came with constant pressure and too few opportunities. But like the others before him, David didn't just become a victim of Jeffrey Dahmer. He became a victim of a society that didn't protect him. Dahmer met David by chance. They were both at the Grand Avenue Mall when Dahmer offered him money to come back to his apartment for a few drinks and photos. David was hesitant. According to Dahmer's own confession, there was a moment when he realized David wasn't going to be compliant, and that made him dangerous in Dahmer's eyes. Not because David posed a threat, but because he might leave and talk. So Dahmer drugged him, and when David was unconscious, he murdered him. But here's the truth that can't be ignored. Dahmer kept targeting young black men because he knew the system wouldn't stop him. He knew the police didn't take missing persons reports seriously, especially not when the missing person was black, poor, or gay. That apathy became his cover. He could keep killing, and no one would come knocking. In fact, David Thomas's disappearance wasn't even connected to Dahmer until after Dahmer was caught. No alert. No manhunt. His life was treated as if it had disappeared into thin air. David Thomas was more than another line in a court transcript. He was a young father trying to make it work. He deserved to be safe, to be seen, to be missed. But the truth is, Dahmer understood what too many still don't want to admit. When society turns a blind eye to entire communities, monsters like him don't just get away with murder. They depend on that silence to keep going. Curtis Strouder was just 17 years old, still in high school, still figuring out who he wanted to be. But he had big dreams. He talked about becoming a model or maybe a fashion designer, something creative, something bold. He was known for his style, his laughter, and his love for his family, especially his grandmother, who raised him after his mother passed away. Curtis had a future, but he never got to live it. Jeffrey Dahmer found him at a bus stop. Like many of his victims, Curtis was simply out trying to get through his day when Dahmer approached with an offer: money in exchange for photos. And like many young black men in Milwaukee struggling to make ends meet, Curtis accepted. What he didn't know was that Dahmer had already decided he wasn't going to walk out of that apartment. Dahmer murdered him that same night. And again, no alarm was sounded. Another black teenager went missing in Milwaukee, and the city barely blinked. Curtis wasn't invisible to the people who loved him, but to the systems that were supposed to protect him, he may as well have been. This wasn't just a killer exploiting vulnerable people. It was a killer operating with the confidence that no one in power would stop him. Because he knew, if the victims were black, if they were poor, if they were gay or didn't have strong family support, their stories wouldn't make it past the police station door. And for Curtis Strouder, that silence was fatal. He was a child, ambitious, full of promise, and loved. But like so many others, he was treated as if his life didn't matter. And that's the real horror behind the headlines. Not just what Dahmer did, but how easily he got away with it. Errol Lindsay was 19 years old, a Milwaukee native, a son, a brother. He loved music, fashion, and had just started fixing up his car. Friends say he was kind and charismatic, the kind of guy who brought energy into a room. He had a close relationship with his family, especially his sister, who later became one of the most vocal advocates for the victims. On the day he vanished, Errol told a friend he was just stepping out to get a key cut. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Dahmer lured him in with the same empty promises he'd used before. But what makes Errol's case even more chilling is what Dahmer was beginning to experiment with. He didn't just drug and kill Errol. He attempted a horrific act that he would later describe as trying to create a zombie, drilling into Errol's skull and pouring acid into his brain, hoping to keep him alive but fully compliant. It didn't work. Errol woke up, dazed and in pain, and Dahmer killed him. Errol was the first victim of this grotesque experiment, and it showed how emboldened Dahmer had become. He wasn't just killing anymore, he was testing boundaries, completely confident no one would intervene. And he was right. When Errol went missing, his family reported it. But nothing happened. No investigation, no urgency. Just another black teen gone. That's the pattern. Again and again. Black families calling for help and being met with silence. Errol Lindsay mattered. But in a city that saw black lives as disposable, his name never made the headlines until it was far too late. And this is the heart of the story. Dahmer wasn't just a predator. He was a man who understood the racial dynamics of the system he lived in. He knew who society cared about and who it didn't. And Errol Lindsay, a bright, loving 19-year-old, paid the price for that silence. They had names. They had dreams. They had people who loved them, but in the end, the world didn't protect them. These young black men were more than victims. They were sons, brothers, artists, students, human beings. And yet, when they disappeared, their cries were met with silence. Jeffrey Dahmer knew that silence. He counted on it. He chose victims who lived at the edges of society, because he knew no one in power would come looking. This isn't just the story of a serial killer. It's the story of a system that failed again and again. Today we speak their names, not just to remember what was lost, but to honor who they were. Their lives mattered, and their stories deserve more than silence. But society didn't treat them like they mattered. And if they had looked different, would the response have been different too? But let's not forget, Dahmer's cruelty didn't stop with race. His victims came from different backgrounds, and each one was failed in some way, by the people, the system, or the silence that let evil hide in plain sight. They all deserved protection. They all deserved justice, and most of all, they all deserved to be remembered.